Good Sabbath, everyone. Good to be with you again. Today I have a story for you to start out the message. One summer evening in Broken Bow, Nebraska, a weary truck driver pulled his rig into an all-night truck stop. Now, he'd been driving all day and he was tired and hungry. And when he walked in, the waitress had just served 3 tough-looking, leather-jacketed motorcyclists. You know, kind of maybe the Hell's Angel type or some other type. But just after she served him, these guys got up and came over and decided to give him a hard time. Not only did they verbally abuse the trucker, one grabbed the hamburger off his plate, another took a handful of his french fries, and the third picked up his coffee and began to drink it. So, how do you think this trucker responded? Yeah, that's right. How would you respond? Well, this trucker did not respond as one might expect. Instead, he calmly rose, picked up his check, walked to the front of the room, put the check and his money on the register, and walked out the door. The waitress followed him to put the money in the cash register and stood there watching out the door as the trucker drove his big truck away into the night. And when she returned to the table, one of the motorcyclists said to her, "Well, he's not much of a man, is he?" She replied, "Well, I don't know about that, but he sure isn't much of a truck driver. He just ran over 3 motorcycles on his way out of the parking lot." Well, we continue this week in our sermon series on the commandments of Jesus in Matthew 5:38 through 42. That's Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42. While you're looking for it, I would ask you, do you ever feel the desire to get even or to seek revenge against people for something they've done to you? Yeah, that's one of the toughest things for most of us to resist. And I know with children, many times it's evident. But in adults, sometimes it takes on more subtle forms, and while other times it's patently obvious what they're trying to do. Anyway, when people wrong us, when they insult us or take our property, our desire is to see them pay for what they did to us. Our sense of self-worth has been affronted and we want to make it right. We want justice. Well, or at least revenge. But how should one who's had their citizenship in heaven respond when things such as this happen to them? Should we respond like the world would? Or does Jesus expect something more from us? Let's read our passage. "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. And give to him who asks you, and for him who wants to borrow from you, don't turn him away." Now, you may have read along with me and said, "Well, Pastor, I thought we were going over 1 commandment. That sounds like several commandments." Well, I can see how you might take it that way, but as I began to study on these, I believe the gist of the message Jesus is giving here, and the title of our sermon today is to respond selflessly. Respond selflessly. Even if it's an evil person with whom we're interacting. Now, in the Old Testament, it was stated and practiced that when an offense occurred, that it would be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Many of us have heard this saying since we grew up. Well, in fact, Jesus is quoting from Exodus 21 through chapter 21, verse 24, Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, and Deuteronomy 19:21. What the misinterpretation is, though, is that many times people take a text out of context and try to apply it to other things. And in fact, even during Jesus' times, this is what had happened. Because this passage was not referring to getting revenge, but how to administer justice. You see, the eye for an eye statement was designed to set guidelines for the judges of Israel when trying to decide what was an appropriate payment of justice for a wrong suffered. They also, as judges, looked at the intent of the crime and took that under consideration. As a result, you can see that the eye for an eye was not always practiced literally in Israel. In fact, by the time of Jesus, physical penalties were largely replaced by monetary fines. Nevertheless, this precept presupposes a world where violence and injustice are taken for granted and it has to be dealt with. Understand here that an eye for an eye was not a command, but a guideline to make sure that the judgments the judges made were fair. An eye for an eye was the worst punishment that could be given. However, this is, again, for judges to make a decision and not revenge, because revenge happens when we feel that justice was not served. So God in His wisdom said that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth would ensure that people would not seek revenge because they knew the judges would administer justice fairly. According to William Barclay in his commentary on Matthew, he said, "So then, ancient ethics were based on the law of tit for tat. It is true that the law was a law of mercy. It is true that it was a law for a judge and not for private individuals. It is also true it was never literally carried out. It's true there were accents of mercy, speaking at the same time. But Jesus here in this passage obliterated the very principle of that law because retaliation, however controlled and restricted, has no place in the Christian life." Let me re-emphasize that very end. Retaliation, however controlled and restricted, has no place in the Christian life. You see, the eye for an eye rule calls people to be exactly what God did not want them to be, which was vengeful. So in this passage, Jesus replaces the eye for an eye rule with a higher standard of conduct. This new standard, or this new command from Jesus, is to respond selflessly. Respond selflessly, and go beyond what was asked in each and every instance. Jesus reveals to us the fact that the Christian life has a higher calling in life than simply seeking revenge. We can spend our time demanding our rights, or, as Jesus has commanded, we can live by a higher law. We can instead be a testimony to God's mercy and interaction in our life as we extend that mercy to others. Now, to be clear, Jesus does not imply that we should not protect ourselves or our families from harm. When Jesus says, "Don't resist him who is evil," He's not implying that we never resist evil. He's saying that we are not to take matters in our own hands as if justice somehow depends on our reaction. You see, Jesus gives us the solution to the heart matter of retaliation. To turn the other cheek, to give more than is required, to go the extra mile, to show mercy to the less fortunate. That's the solution. Now let's talk about turning the other cheek for a moment. Most people were right-handed, so for a person to get slapped on the right cheek, a right-handed person would have to do it with the back of their hand. It's possible in this passage Jesus may be speaking more of taking an insult than someone coming up and beating you to a pulp. You see, Jesus tells us that regardless of how the injury happens, we may suffer some personal insult or injury for His sake. Now, in Jewish culture, getting slapped with the back of the hand was the ultimate insult. And again, we're not instructed to passively allow ourselves to be beaten to death. Because even when Jesus was struck by a Jewish officer in John 18:23, he asked, why was that done? You see, we're not to take it on ourselves to retaliate when we're insulted. Matter of fact, let me repeat that because I know this is a phenomenal thing to think about. We are not to take it on ourselves to retaliate when insulted. We are to use that as an opportunity to witness Christ to others. So I ask you, are you willing to suffer insult for Christ? Do you love Him enough to keep this command? Or do we have to get back at the person who insults us and trade an insult for an insult? Think about it. Now the law, moving on to the next part about the tunic and the cloak, the law did not allow the outer garment to be taken from a person since it protected them from the cold. The tunic, which was the long sack-like inner garment, was made of cotton or linen, and the poorest man would have a change of tunics. But the cloak was a great blanket-like outer garment which a man wore as a robe by day and used for a blanket at night. And of these garments, most Jews would only have one. Would you believe it was actually a Jewish law that a man's tunic might be taken as a pledge, but you could not take his cloak? If you're interested, you can turn there. Exodus chapter 22, verses 26 and 27. Exodus chapter 22, 26 and 27. It says, if you ever take your neighbor's garment in pledge, i.e. his cloak, you shall restore it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his mantle for his body. And what else shall he sleep? You see, the point is here that by right, a man's cloak could not be permanently taken from him. Now, going back to this passage, obviously, from the person Jesus is describing, an evil person, we have a person who's trying to take every advantage of the law, suing people, smacking people, whatever the case may be. And Jesus is saying it's better to suffer a small loss than to have an attitude of revenge. And yet we're created such self-centered creatures that that's our very first reaction. Smack me in the face, I'll smack you back. Yeah, you laugh, but you know that's how you feel. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 7 tells us we are better off being taken advantage of than bringing shame to Christ. Think about that, though. Folks, it's better off that we're taking advantage of than to bring shame to Christ. Now, does this mean that we allow someone to take everything we own? No. The point of this is that we're not to allow the material things that we do have to get in the way of our ability to witness for Christ. We are not to allow the material things we do have to get in the way of our witness for Christ. And as a result, sometimes that's going to cost us some material possessions. We're not to be selfish like the world. Folks, we're called to be different. There will be times when our faith in Christ will cause us a loss of property. Read it, believe it, accept it, embrace it. This is what you're called to do. But if we are losing our property for Christ's sake, then we have to believe that God has something better in mind for us. So how far are we willing to let our faith in Jesus take us? Are we going to love Christ to the point of losing our possessions? Or will material things be more important than spreading the gospel, than being Jesus, even to those who are evil? Now, in the next portion of this passage, Jesus talks about going the extra mile. Jesus was telling him to do joyfully what was repulsive to them at the time. You see, he was referring to helping out Romans who dominated them. You see, the Romans had a practice of commandeering civilians to carry military equipment or a soldier's personal items. And this was especially infuriating to the Jewish population of Palestine. And I believe Jesus was alluding to this practice. But rather than excite outrage or resentment, He instead charges his followers to volunteer not only to do what they're asked to do, but even more than what they're asked to do. Go that second mile carrying that stuff. By doing so, once again, Jesus assumes a new starting point for human relationships based upon the kingdom principles. That we're to even respond to humiliating situations by doing good. We are to respond to humiliating situations by doing good. Now you have to understand, again, that those who were listening to him, this was one of the worst things that could happen to a Jewish citizen in their mind. Yet even today, Christians struggle with injustice, sometimes for the silliest of things. Can you believe somebody sat in my pew today? Don't they know that's where I sit every Sabbath? Oh, I guess I better keep going before I step on too many toes. How far are we willing to go with Jesus? Will we be people who are always demanding our rights in every situation? Are we willing to sacrifice our rights if it will spread the gospel? Now you may be asking, how could God ask this of us? I say, how could He not? He who did so much for us. He died on the cross. He paid the price that we owed. He purchased us through His blood. Have no choice but to do what He said out of love and appreciation and gratitude for what He has done for us. And Jesus is telling us that when we have the opportunity to help people, we should take advantage of the opportunity. The last portion of this verse does not mean that we give the town drunk money for more booze, or the able-bodied lazy person who refuses to work more money to loaf off with. It means that after we recognize a true need, that we should do what we can to help with the need in a wise manner. In fact, there are several places, again in the Old Testament, which encourage paying attention and being sensitive to the poor and those in need. Places like Exodus 22, verse 25. Exodus 22:25. Leviticus 25, 36 through 37. Leviticus chapter 25, 36 through 37. And Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11. You see, in our passage today, Jesus' words call for a generous spirit, one that refuses to put one's personal possessions or needs above the needs of others. You've heard that saying, see a need, fill a need. This is embodied in what Jesus is saying here. Now, while each specific response to a request will vary according to the situation, what he's talking about is that the motivation for our decision to help should be the command of Christ to respond selflessly rather than for our own personal interest. Let me say that again. When faced with an issue, a chance to help out, a chance to lift a brother or sister up, whether they're in the Lord or not, a fellow human being, it may vary according to the situation, but the motivation for our every decision should be this command of Christ to respond selflessly rather than from our own personal interest. You see, in each of Jesus' statements in this passage, He proposes a course of action that runs counter to conventional thinking and behavior. The old man within us, the old woman within us, refuses, hates this passage because it calls for death to self. It calls for living in the Spirit, and our actions showing the Spirit of God working through us. The intention here was to radically challenge how we think, how we respond to all instances of abuse, insult, and injustice. In this unsaved, self-centered world, folks, the genuine and radical selflessness of a Christian provides a powerful witness to the presence and power of Christ in the believer's life when we respond selflessly. Folks, I tell you today, Jesus has commanded us to a different standard and a different life. A life of responding selflessly. A life that sometimes will involve tough choices. Swallowing our pride. Giving up possessions. Going the extra mile. But these are choices that we need to be willing to make for the sake of Jesus, whom we love. Jesus clearly commands selflessness in this passage. I leave you with this question for you for the week. Do you love Christ enough to respond selflessly in every situation? May God lead and guide you in your walk with Him in the coming week. Amen.